So I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Board of Directors to the 2024 Annual General Meeting for Percheron Therapeutics Limited. And I would like to thank a number of you. Firstly, our shareholders who have continued to support us, our vendors that have continued to help us, but most importantly, I want to thank the parents and the patients that have trusted us to enter our clinical trial. Our company has come a long way in the last 12 months. The AGM gives us the opportunity to do really two things. The one is to obviously assess shareholder sentiment through the voting for the resolutions. But the other thing that it does is it allows us to review some of the key achievements and developments of the year. Sometimes not all of those are immediately apparent. Probably the most significant this year, without question, has been the conduct and progression of our international phase 2 trial of avicursen, which we used to call ATL 1102, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. At last year's AGM, the study had started in terms of sites, submissions to ethics, but we were still to bring on sites and still to recruit patients. And yes, we did have some delays in sites being opened from what was first anticipated, and that was due to delays at regulatory authorities and with ethics committees over the time period. For example, the MHRA had a 4-month backlog. In Turkey, the Central Ethics Committee was on strike for quite a long period of time, and these things were unforeseen. Despite those delays, the actual recruitment time from when we had the sites open and when we could get first patient in to last patient in was actually very rapid, and it was within the time frame that we had predicted. And you took a significant effort on behalf of our team. And of course, the trial is now long since fully recruited, and we're now in the very exciting but quite honestly nerve-wracking phase, while we await this initial 6-month data next month with great anticipation. This will be the first significant clinical readout of the company in the last 4 years. It's actually quite a long time between a phase 2A and a phase 2B, and it does highlight specifically the development or maturity of the organization. It won't be the last, because this is the top-line data, and James will explain what we mean by top-line data. We will be seeing more data the way the trial is designed. We will be seeing more data, the 12-month data, in approximately the middle of 2025, and then the final results of the study later in 2025. And this study design really affords us multiple opportunities to win. But the initial data in December is intended to and will no doubt provide investors with the first meaningful opportunity to reassess the value of the company. And it will provide the Percheron team with a much more informed sense of direction and what needs to come next. And this James will cover as well. Now, it is easy to imagine that the interpretation of the data could be quite straightforward. Did the pull-2 improve or it didn't? And it's really not as simple as that. The clinical trial is not a pass-fail test. In reality, for diseases as complex as Duchenne, we are obliged to consider the totality of the data, including all the various measures of efficacy, which James will go over, as well as safety. And to discuss those results with the investigators that were involved, with our key opinion leaders, the regulators, and patient advocacy, before we can fully form a view of the implications. So what I really want to stress is that, yes, the data in December is really important for us to see, and it's going to give us an idea of how the drug is performing and how the patients are responding. I stress this is a chronic disease. By the time the boys came into the study, the majority of them have been expressing the physical manifestations of the disease for 10 years or more. There's a lot of chronic inflammation in them. And 6 months is a drop in the ocean compared to how long they have had the disease. So while we expect to see some changes, it is possible that the full amount, the full quantification of those changes won't be seen before 12 months. And also the amount of data that we get in December is really just part of the overall picture. So we really need to keep that in mind as our perspectives will evolve over 2025. As we head into next year and towards the results, the board decided to take advantage of growing investor interest in the company to execute a capital raise, which has substantially strengthened the balance sheet. And based on the current plans, it leaves us funded to the conclusion of the ongoing phase 2B study in late calendar year 2025. And I'm sure you appreciate the importance of being able to do that, ensure that the study is completely funded till the end. It also gives us the opportunity, as we announced a short while ago, to allow those boys that the investigators deem are gaining benefit to have ongoing access to the study drug through what's known as a compassionate use program, which we have to fund. I know that there are people who feel the capital raise was not done in the optimal way. You don't know all the background, some of which we will be able to share with you, and I expect that James will in his presentation. A wise person who has been in the biotech industry for a long time and done a number of these capital raises within a company, within a biotech environment, not the bankers, gave me some very good advice. He said 3 things to me. He said, 1, the best time to do a capital raise is yesterday. There is never a perfect price for the capital raise, and you will never have everybody agreeing as to what that price should be or the discount should be. And he said, thirdly, what you must never forget is that the aim is to raise enough money to keep your company going. Because, yes, there is dilution when you have a capital raise, but there's far greater loss to your shareholders if you cannot keep your company moving at the pace it needs to. Good advice. We did not take the decision to conduct a capital raise lightly. And as I said, we're aware that there are a wide range of view of shareholders, some who are concerned and some even in the top 20 who are very supportive. The board took several factors into consideration before moving ahead. For one, we really wanted to be able to share the results with the market in December without this overhang of financial matters and a need to do a capital raise. After we had released our annual report, it would have been evident, and it was evident to the market, that a capital raise would be required to get us to the end of the clinical trial. And we really did not want that overhang when we released the results. Of course, one of the big objectives for us is to partner Avicursen. And really, the clinical data is usually the big catalyst for pharma to partner. And it takes a long time when you're working with pharma to get them to that stage where they make the decision to invest. There's been a lot of work this year laying the groundwork with potential partners. There's a lot that they look at. It's not just the data that's coming out in the clinical trial. Those that are interested and have been in our data room, they've looked at everything with Avicursen back years. They've looked at everything and how it's been developed, how it's come along, everything that's been done with it. The other part that they're really interested in do the diligence on is our team. And they also do diligence on how do we manage our business and what's our runway and how solid an investment would we be. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were financially stable going into partnership discussions, which we expect to be happening from the new year onwards once this data is available and we've really thought through it. And James is at JP Morgan in the new year. Although we've maintained our focus on Duchenne, our laser-like focus on Duchenne, we have been also looking at expansion opportunities for Avicursen and for Percheron. And ensuring the success of this drug in Duchenne is our most important near-term task, but it's not all the company is aspiring to. And as you know, we've released some preclinical data in autoimmune epilepsy, for example, and exemplifies the range of possible additional uses for the drug, which may in future provide attractive opportunities and create additional value. That too, of course, is part of the reason that we did some of our capital raising. And we hope very much that the year ahead will provide us opportunities to start spreading our wings. I spoke last year, you'll recall, about our evolution as a company, which at that time was most clearly illustrated by our successful proposal to you to change the name of the business to Percheron Therapeutics. And I can report to you now, 12 months later, that the name change has imbued our business with a fresh energy, which many of our stakeholders have noted. We've built on that rejuvenation in a number of ways, but most importantly in the composition of the team. Biotech is perhaps the most talent-dependent industry that I know of, and we have attracted a robust group of highly experienced individuals and executives to lead the company. And as a director of the company and as a shareholder of the company, I feel entirely confident that our business is in very capable hands. However, talent comes at a price. Been in this industry a long time, and I've done a tremendous amount of hiring. And I know what it takes to attract the talent, but more importantly, to retain that talent. We've set our remuneration components using comparable benchmarks within our biotech community. And the step-up reported in our 2024 remuneration report, I know, has caused consternation amongst shareholders. And the board has heard the concerns and will take under advisement that feedback as we review our compensation policies, which we do annually at our remuneration committee. And as a step towards providing greater clarity related to our short-term and long-term incentive awards, we will share the company's corporate objectives against which we hold employees accountable. And James will do that later in his presentation. Before closing, I want to pay a brief tribute to Leon Seri AM. For those of you that have attended in person, you may remember that Leon was a regular attendee at the AGMs, and he was here last year. Leon sadly passed away in September of this year. In my time as chair of the board, I'd come to respect his indefatigable intelligence and energy, and to greatly value his wise counsel, which was always generously given, and to treasure his support and encouragement. Today's AGM seems a slightly lesser event as I look across the room and note his absence. However, he remained until the end exceptionally proud of the company, and of all of us continue to be inspired by his legacy. To conclude, I want to acknowledge the priceless contributions and support, particularly this year, of my fellow non-executive director, Dr. Gil Price, who has continued to drive for the company's success in a great many ways. I also want to recognize our CEO, Dr. James Garner, his first year with the organization, as well as his management team. And Dr. Takas has now joined us. Thank you, George, for joining. So George and Deborah that are here with us, and to thank them for their unceasing efforts, their support, and their accomplishments this year. Finally, I really do mean this. Thank you, shareholders, for your ongoing support of the company. I know this has been a long journey for many of us, and I see shareholders here who were, in this share nearly 20 years ago. And I know there are some online who told me that they would be here. At long last, though, we are poised to see the initial efforts of our combined results. This is indeed the substance of which great biotech companies are formed. Laser focus on DMD, but now let's keep our focus where it really needs to be, and that is those results in December. I look forward to sharing our successes with you over the coming months and in the year ahead. I would now like to hand over to Dr. Garner for the CEO address.
Very good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my pleasure to add my own welcome to you to today's AGM. This is, of course, our first as Percheron Therapeutics. And if we can move ahead to the first slide of the management presentation here, I really want to do three things in the next 20 minutes or so. I want to try and give you a little bit of a recap of the year that we've had. An awful lot happened over the last 12 months since we last met. I really just want to review some of those things and talk through some of the company's key achievements. But then I want to talk a little bit about next month, because, of course, we've still got the major event of the year to come, which is our data readout from the phase 2b clinical trial. So I want to talk a little bit about that and really start to provide a few pointers about at least what we're going to be looking for in that data. And then finally, I just want to talk in a more general way about the year ahead. And I'm going to ask again that we maybe hold the questions till the end here, just so that we can get through all the material. But once we've been through all that, we'd be delighted to open the floor to questions. So if we can jump ahead 3 slides, please. And one more. There we go. So this is really just a summary of some of the key things that we've done this year. And of course, all these things happen week by week, month by month, and sometimes only really at the end of the year, you look back on it all and realize all the things that have happened during the year. But as Charmaine touched on a moment ago, I think one of the key things this year that we've all been focused on has been our ongoing phase 2b clinical trial of evacuercin. And we fully recruited that study in May. It took about 11 months from beginning to end to recruit 48 patients to the study. By the standards of rare disease studies, that's actually exceptionally fast. And of course, what that means now is that we will be seeing the initial data from that study next month. We are just about to launch on data. People who've been following the story for a little while will be familiar with some of the vicissitudes the company has faced in relation to toxicology, the 9-month tox study that has been floating around for the last couple of years, a requirement, of course, by the US Food and Drug Administration for us to run clinical trials of any length there. That study has been completed, as we shared with the market a couple of months ago. And we'll be going to FDA sometime in the new year to talk that through with them. And we're holding off a little bit on that because we want to also take to that meeting the initial clinical data from the phase 2b study. It's not something FDA has asked for, but we think it's a more powerful package if we can show them not just monkey data, but human data. So we're holding off till we get that data in December, and then we'll be going to FDA sometime in the new year. I spoke last year a little bit about the need to publish our data. Clinicians, partners, many investors don't read ASX announcements. We need to get our data into peer-reviewed scientific journals. And we've really been making a lot of effort to do that this year. And crucially, the earlier phase 2a study of evacuersin, study that was completed a few years ago now, was published at the beginning of this year in a leading peer-reviewed journal. Charmaine touched on the data that we shared a couple of months ago in autoimmune epilepsy. As you've heard, we're thinking about other uses of the drug. And, we think this drug has enormous commercial potential in Duchenne, but we think it has great component. And we'll be looking at the subgroups here to see, look, does the drug seem to have more effect on, say, the distal limb than the proximal limb, the wrist than the shoulder. So we'll be looking at all those sort of things as well. And this is really important because, as Charmaine touched on in her address, the way regulatory agencies look at drugs like this in diseases like this is that they rarely look purely at one endpoint. They look rather at, to use a buzzword, the totality of the evidence. They look at the aggregate pool of the data, and they really look to see what does this tell us about how the drug is doing. Most of the drugs that have been approved in Duchenne over the last decade have failed to meet primary endpoints in their clinical trial. But FDA in particular has approved them because their consideration has been that the totality of the evidence supports the idea that they provide benefit to patients. So we'll be looking at all of the data we get to really try and make that case. And then finally, pretty much the most important thing in this study is actually the safety profile. Almost all of the drugs that are currently available for Duchenne have significant toxicities, especially in the context of small children. And we think one of the potential differentiators for Evacuersen is going to be its favorable safety profile. So we'll be looking really closely at the granular detail of the safety data to understand how that compares. Next slide, please. So that's a whirlwind tour of some of our clinical data. As I say, there'll be these and many other things that we'll be pouring over in the weeks and the months ahead. But I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of a premonition of some of the things we'll be talking to. And then finally, just last couple of slides here, and then we'll open the floor for questions. I want to talk a little bit about the year ahead for our company. So next slide, please. I'm just going to recapitulate 2 slides from our general corporate presentation. I think a few of you will have seen these before and heard me talk about this. But one of the broader questions that our data is going to start to answer is the regulatory path forward for Evacuersen. And as I've said before, there's 3 very broad ways this can go. You know, if we really are seeing shoot the lights out data, we want to open ourselves to the possibility of discussing accelerated approval with FDA. That is to say, approval off the basis of this study. Very, very difficult to give you a sense at this stage of what the odds are here, but we can really get a much closer idea as we look into the clinical trial data. So this is something we're going to be thinking about all the time as we start to see data come through. How well could this study support us in trying to get an early registration for the drug? If the data is not quite there, then I think the question becomes, well, what does this data tell us about what is needed to get the drug to the finish line? What kind of study would be required? How big is it? How long is it? And so on. So this is a set of questions that we'll be discussing with the clinicians and with our regulatory advisors and so on. And then, of course, as I always say, the reality of biotech is we never know what's going to happen, and so we always think about how do we insulate the company and its shareholders from the downside. And of course, we have many other opportunities for Evacuersen. This is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a one-trick pony. Next slide, please. Right off the back of our data readout, we'll be going to the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference in January. This is one of the 2 key partnering events in the year for biotech companies, and there is no better way to turn up in San Francisco for this conference than with an armful of data. So the timing here is extremely auspicious for us. I've said many times that data is the great lubricant to partnering transactions. And the good news is that we are very, very far from starting from square one. We've been out there investing the time over the course of this year, building those relationships, familiarizing people with the drug. We have a number of companies that have already undertaken confidential diligence. So with this data in hand, we think it's a very, very opportune moment to really try and progress those discussions and try and start converting leads into potential partnerships for the drug. So I think that's going to be one of our key areas of focus in 2025. Next slide, please. And then there's been some discussion about goals and objectives and performance criteria. And we take this very seriously. Last year, we started to put in place a very, very systematic performance management system for the company. And I'm not going to go here into each individual employee's objectives because realistically, no company does that. But I'm very happy to share in a broad sense what our corporate objectives are, because I think it's something you should know. And they're really these. So obviously, the phase 2b clinical trial is our key priority for the year ahead. This will be the year in which this study completes. It'll be reading out multiple data readouts in 2025, but we will bring this study to its absolute conclusion this year. So that's really kind of top of the list for us. But right behind that, we need to get this drug back in the game with FDA. As I think long-standing shareholders will be aware, The drug is currently what we call on partial clinical hold with FDA. We need to fix that. And so in the new year, we'll be going to the agency with the clinical data, with the toxicology data, and with the goal of lifting the partial clinical hold. Partnering is a big part of our focus this year. I think it's always a much easier conversation with data, as we just reflected. And then I think one of the things we do want to turn our attention to is the broader composition of our pipeline. Charmaine has referred many times to the laser-like focus of the company on ATL-1102, on avocasen in Duchenne, and I think that's been entirely appropriate for the last 18 months or so. But we do need to think more broadly about what our long-term looks like. And some of that we've started to point to this year, for example, with the preclinical data in autoimmune epilepsy. But this is something we'll be thinking about a little bit over the year ahead. What do we do with 1103? What else can we be doing in the meantime with 1102? And then finally, we want to make sure that we can afford to do these things. There is nothing worse than a biotech company with a promising pipeline that can't afford to move it forward. And so we make no apologies for continuing to focus on that as one of the key objectives of the business. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. I really just want to leave this sort of parting thought with you, some of the key things ahead, what this translates to in terms of milestones. We've pretty much hit all our key milestones for this year. I see a nice column of green ticks there on the right. One more big thing, of course, this year, next month, our phase 2b data readout, initial top-line data there. But as we look forward into 2025, you can see some of the key things that investors and stakeholders should be looking out for in the year ahead. Regulatory consultation, further clinical data, and so on. So it's going to be a busy year ahead for the company, and I think an exciting year for us, and really looking forward to continuing to share it with you all. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'll stop there. I'd be really happy to throw the floor open to questions. Just a procedural matter. First of all, as Charmaine asked at the beginning, I'm going to suggest that we hold questions that are specific to the resolutions of the AGM to the formal business of the AGM. And for those online, it's only whoever's standing here that can be seen. So what I'm going to suggest maybe is that any questions that are really addressed to me, I answer now. But if there's perhaps questions for Charmaine or Gil, we try and sort of batch those up so that we're not constantly shuffling backwards and forwards. We'll see how well this works. But perhaps if we can initially address questions for me and then questions for the other directors. So, ladies and gentlemen, Gennady.
Gennady, we need to give you a microphone if you wouldn't mind holding on. We're going to pass one to you. Thank you.
That's all. Thank you for your presentation. That's very informative. Just have a question about European regulatory pathway. If you could comment on that. Initially, I understand the company started the trial in Europe because it was the quickest path to market with no restrictions on the tox from the likes of the FDA. But if you comment where you're at with the European regulators.
Of course. And just to make sure, in case anybody online didn't hear, the question was around European regulatory pathway and where we stand there. So, look, the reality is almost all drugs these days are developed for the global market. I think the notion that we develop a drug for a particular region or a particular country has never really been particularly applicable. It used to be the case a little bit in Japan. We would find these quirky Japan-only drugs. And historically, a few drugs that have been available in Europe, but not in the United States or elsewhere. But in general, the economics of drug development is such that it only ever really makes sense to develop drugs for the whole world. It's so expensive, it's so time-consuming, it's so risky that we really want to have the biggest possible market for our product at the end. So drug development these days is almost inherently global, and that's very much how we think about this. So I talk a lot about FDA because the reality is that for any new medicine, the United States is around 45 to 50% of the commercial opportunity. The European Union, including the United Kingdom, is about half of that. Japan, maybe kind of 10-12%, and then it sort of falls back from there. So we focus first and foremost on FDA, and we sometimes get lazy and talk almost as if that's the only show in town. But right behind that, we're thinking about the European Union, we're thinking about Japan, we're thinking about China, we're thinking about other markets as well. But so Ganani, answer to your question, we're really trying to think about this globally. We're trying to think about all the territories, and there is, as I say, behind FDA, a strategy around Europe, and around Japan, and around other territories as well. Veronica, let's see if thanks, Alexander. If it's green, it's on.
Okay. My question or comment is in relation to the capital raise that we just had.
Right.
And how it was established. My understanding is that conversations were had with the people involved or getting it set up was when we were around about 10 cents. There's an approximate 20% discount, which I can understand. But what I don't understand is why there wasn't a safety net put in place in the event that the share price did go up to the extent that it did, for it to then be pretty much near capped down to 8 cents. I mean, where's the respect to the company as an entity itself to protect itself that, at 10 cents, 8 cents is a 2 cent discount, a 20% discount. To have something written in that in the event that the share price raises, the discount will be 2 cents or the greater of either 8 cents or 2 cents less than the 5-day VWAP or whatever time frame you want to put in place. That type of respect for who we are as a company, we need to respect our value already. That near capping, I just can't understand.
Sure. So, you okay for me to talk to this? So let's talk a little bit about how capital raising happens in companies, just to give everybody a broad context. Veronica, I know you've probably got a little bit more insight than many into this, but let me just sort of set the scene a little bit, and then we can talk a little bit specifically in relation to our company. So, as you've said, capital raisings don't emerge completely out of nothing. The decision to go ahead with one usually happens pretty last minute, but we've been out there all the time. Since I joined the company in August last year, I take multiple investor meetings a week. We've been out there really trying to put the company forward. We've been out there constantly talking to potential new investors in the company. And as these conversations start to build up momentum, and as people start to think about pricing, they do tend to think about it in relation to not just the spot price on that particular day, but in relation to some sort of average price over the last few weeks. Typically, in practice, a 30-day VWAP, volume-weighted average price. And Veronica, as you've noted, I think one of the challenges that we ended up with in this capital raise is as we were starting to go live, as the train was pulling out of the station on the capital raise, the share price has been rock solid around 10 cents for, 6-8 weeks. And at that point, an 8-cent raise is a 20% discount. And I'll tell you that if you look across the whole field, if you look at companies of our size, pre-revenue biotech companies, this year, the median discount has been around 23% from memory. So actually it felt like a pretty good deal. And I think the 3 or 4 trading sessions up to this deal going live, the share price jumped up to 13 cents. So I know you asked the question, well, wasn't there some way to build in some kind of ratchet to this, some sort of stopgap? Unfortunately, there just isn't. Once you start to get bids into a transaction, there isn't really a lot of scope to reprice them on the fly. We did try, for what it's worth. We did go back to the couple of investors that had started to get serious about this and said, look, share price has gone up to 13 cents. What about it? They said, well, look, the 30-day VWAP is still around 10 something. And they say, you've gone up to 13 cents with no new information. There's been no news out of the company. It could come back down to 10 cents again any time. And we would not have had a transaction at a higher price. I can tell you with absolute certainty, having been in the room for every single discussion, we either did this raise at 8 cents or we didn't do it at all. That was just the fact of it. Right, I think you were sort of pointing to the question, well, how should shareholders feel about this? And look, I'm a shareholder in the company too, and I'm also a director of the company. And tell you that, issue shares for the greatest reluctance in the company. I'd rather be buying them back, if the truth be told. But we are a pre-revenue company. We don't yet make free cash flow. We need to finance our business. And sure, this has introduced a bit of a setback into the share price. It's come back, a few cents since we did the raise. We'll see a little bit where it washes out once this settles. And it's always the case after raise. There's some turbulence in the share price. But we're not really here trying to produce a kind of 10, 20, even 30% rise in the share price. That's not what we consider is doing justice to our shareholders. Spoke about respect for our shareholders. I think if we were to come to you and brag, well, we've increased the value of the business by 30%, I'm not sure that would be something that we should be satisfied with. I'll just finish the point here. A biotech company like ours should be striving to offer its investors a multiple of return, a 5x, an 8x, a 10x return. That's what our goal should be as a business. We may or may not achieve that, because obviously that depends on clinical data. It depends on all the many risks that go with our business. But that should be our aspiration. And we will only ever be able to do that if we can fully finance the work that we're doing. And so, if we give up a couple of cents for the greater long-term good of being able to deliver clinical data, which is the catalyst more often than not that revalues companies fundamentally, we think that's in the interest of shareholders. And we think that's how we ultimately, as you put it, pay respect to our shareholders.
Sorry, it wasn't actually the respect to the shareholders, it was respect to the company. So I think that we undersold the company by not just having it written in before the conversations even happened, before it was announced to the market that in the event, because all these conversations happen, people know about it, funnily enough, the share price starts rising.
Yeah.
The momentum just got scuttled.
Yeah. Again, Veronica, I don't want to labor the point, but what you're really describing is essentially a put option. So what you're describing here is a commitment by an investor to invest in the company at a fixed discount to any market price. I can tell you with absolute certainty, there is no professional investor in the world that would sign up to that. That would not be a viable transaction. And you can understand why, because for an investor, that's an uncapped liability. If the share price rockets up to 50 cents, they're still on the hook to buy shares at 48 cents in the scenario you described. An investor won't do that. Investors need absolute certainty about what they're going to, they have a pool of money to manage. They need to know this much to the dollar is going into Percheron. They need to know exactly when, they need to know exactly what price. And if any of those parameters change, they walk away. These are not as agile transactions as we like to think. And one of the things that we were really trying to do in this raise was to focus on bringing new institutional holders into raise. This was a transaction entirely dominated by institutional holders. There were some existing individual holders that came on board, but the bulk of the money went to institutional holders. And we did that very, very deliberately, because in the long run, those are the investors that are going to kind of help the company grow. We don't think it's appropriate for a company like ours to be sort of twisting the arm of individual retail shareholders. We think that fundamentally we should be looking to institutional money to fund the business, and but they are a less flexible audience than retail shareholders. Whereas in a retail focused transaction, sometimes we have a little bit more agility. I think when we're talking to fund managers, professional money managers, they like a very, very high degree of certainty up front. And it doesn't give us a lot of flexibility in a transaction. It's the old metaphor of an oil tanker. Once it's moving, you can't easily turn it around.
And just quickly,
those institutional holders will be?
Can we just repeat the question, please? That came though.
Yeah, so the gentleman just asked, can we say anything about the institutional holders that have come on board? Look, here's my take on this, right? So obviously any shareholder who owns more than 5% of the company has to file a so-called substantial share commercial potential beyond that as well. And so one of the things we've been quietly doing in the background is to start exploring some of these opportunities and starting to map out where else we go. And then I won't go through all of these things, but we've had patents granted for the drug. We've had, any number of scientific conferences where we've been present. We've really been engaging very deeply this year with both the clinician community and with the patient advocacy community. To bring a drug forward in a disease like Duchenne requires allies. It requires the broad support of all the stakeholders involved in the treatment of patients. And this is something that I think historically, if I may say so, the company probably hasn't done a great job of. And we've really been trying to fix that this year. We have a colleague now based in the United States who's been working very hard on engaging with some of the top clinicians in this field and with the patient advocacy organizations. And you can see here some of the clinician advisory boards right at the bottom of this list. One of the things we've been doing to really make sure that the drug is known, the drug is understood, the drug has that awareness and familiarity that it needs. So this is some of what we've been doing this year. And if we just move on to the next slide, it's sort of got a little bit of a, kind of a pictorial depiction of this. One of the things, again, that I think biotech companies can sometimes be guilty of is spending too much time in the office and, focusing on poring over clinical data and scientific publications. We've been out there this year. We've been doing everything we possibly can to get out in front of our stakeholders, our shareholders, the clinicians, advisory groups, patients. We've been at all the major international conferences that are relevant to our work. We've been doing, many of you have been to our open house meetings that we do twice a year. So we've really been trying to get out there. And I think already in just the last 12 months, the sort of brief life of Percheron, I think already the company has achieved quite a familiarity with the many stakeholders that we work with. Next slide, please. Now, how does that translate into performance? And of course, I think all of us in the room, I'm sure, watch the share price, not even day by day, but perhaps even hour by hour when the market is open. And it's easy to watch the ups and downs and kind of sometimes lose track of the bigger picture. But the fact of the matter is, over the last 12 months since we were last here, our share price has increased 42%. And in doing so, it outperforms the ASX 200, it outperforms the S&P 500, it outperforms the NASDAQ Composite, it outperforms the NASDAQ Biotech Index, and it outperforms the ASX Healthcare Index. So I describe this as a good start. This is certainly not something that we feel any kind of complacency about, but I think it certainly reflects a company whose work is starting to be recognized in the broader market. Share price is often a very lagging indicator, and it's often a very noisy indicator. And so one of the ways that we certainly think about our performance is with the concept of enterprise value. And obviously, for a company like ours, which is pre-revenue, all the usual kind of corporate metrics that investors track, revenue growth, EPS, profit margins, those kind of things, they're not really applicable for a company at our stage in development. It's still a very early growth company. And so what people often look at for companies like ours is enterprise value. And very broadly speaking, the market cap of the company is comprised of two components: the cash, which represents our runway. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And the enterprise value, which is the value of the business, the value of our pipeline, the value of our relationships, our brands, and so on. And the enterprise value of Percheron over the last 12 months has increased from about $29 million to about $65 million. We've added $36 million of enterprise value to the business in FY 2024. And I think this is a useful metric for us to reflect on because, of course, what you as shareholders want to understand is what we're doing with your money. Last year, we raised $11.6 million from shareholders, and we used that to generate $36 million of enterprise value. So represents, if you like, a sort of notional return on that investment of about threefold. Again, that's not something any of us should feel satisfied by, but I would say it's a good start. And I think, again, that reflects the fact that the vast majority of the money we spend goes directly into our R&D and directly, in particular, into advancing our clinical program. Next slide, please. And just to sort of build on that pattern here, you can see on the left our last 4 quarters of cash flow. And one of the things you see, which is very, very typical for companies at our stage, this is very lumpy. We have some very expensive quarters, some rather quieter quarters. And that reflects the reality of clinical trials. We don't really have a kind of steady state. We have some big bills some quarters and some quiet quarters. But you get a sense of roughly kind of where the company's money goes. And what this also kind of suggests is the notion of the company's runway. And this is something we've been very, very sensitive to this year. One of the major determinants of how pre-revenue biotech companies are valued is nothing to do with the progress of the clinical pipeline, but it's to do with the company's runway, its survivability, if you like. And so as Charmaine touched on in her address, this is one of the things that we've been trying to solve for in our recent capital raising activity. And look, capital raisings always happen at a discount, and it's always painful. And if it's any consolation, it's no less painful for us in the company than it is for people who are shareholders in the company. But the reality is that usually translates in the medium to long term into the performance of the company. And we actually did some analysis on this out of curiosity. We looked at all the companies under $200 million with less than $10 million of revenue in the biotech sector. Those that in FY24 raised more than 4 quarters of cash returned in that year a total shareholder return of 56%. Companies that raised 4 quarters or less of cash, which last year included us, had an average shareholder return of 26%, and companies that didn't raise cash at all in our size bracket were dead flat. So the market recognizes longevity, it recognizes runway at least as much as it recognizes clinical results, and at least as much as it recognizes scientific performance. And that's been something we've been really attentive to as we think forward to next month and to our own imminent data readout. We don't want people thinking about runway. We want people thinking about clinical data. And so it's one of the reasons why we were very, very determined to try and just take this off the table in advance of next month's data readout. Next slide, please. Before we come to that data readout, I just want to step back a little bit and reflect on some of the things that's been happening in the broader sector here. And I'm not going to go through all these points here. By the way, this presentation is available on our website for download, so anybody who wants to pore over any of these slides, they're freely available. But it's been a busy year in the Duchenne space, suffice to say. We've seen progress with some of the key drugs in development, noticeably Capricor's deramiocel, CAP1002. We've seen both some successes and failures. We've seen the full approval of Sarepta's Elevidys, delandistrogene moxeparvovec, and the discontinuation of Pfizer's gene therapy product, reflecting, I think, both the potential and the challenges in this particular technology space. And then of great interest to us, we've seen a very, very quirky drug approved, Duvyzat, from Ital Pharmaco, a European spec pharma company, which was approved earlier this year and launched just a few months ago. And we watched that with great interest because it's a drug that is pitching itself broadly as a kind of anti-inflammatory treatment. There's been a lot of noise in the Duchenne space from drugs that are attempting to restore and replace dystrophin, but still not very much activity in drugs which are targeting inflammation. And of course, that's what we're doing. That's our take on Duchenne. So we've been watching Duvyzat with great interest. And it's still a very, very young drug in the market. It's only a couple of months into its commercial life, but that's one that I think we'll be watching closely over the year ahead. Next slide, please. It remains really tough out there for biotech companies. I think when I go to conferences in the US, you often hear investors and bankers talk about the last few years as being a nuclear winter for the biotech sector, which is a rather melodramatic way to put it, but I think it's not untrue. As you can see from the chart on the left, over the last couple of years, we've seen about 10% of the biotech sector disappear, about 80 odd companies there that have vanished. And to be clear, those are not companies by and large that have been acquired or have merged or anything else. Those are companies that have gone out of business, and almost invariably because they weren't able to finance themselves. And particularly, as you can see from the middle panel, it's companies that have negative enterprise value, of which there's still about 120 on NASDAQ, that really struggle the most. That's where the attrition is, the companies that have been unable to build the value in their pipeline. But the good news is, and I think the thing that we really focus on, is that the market recognizes late-stage pipelines. I think that's really where we see a very, very significant value inflection across the industry. And as you can see from the panel on the right here, as companies transition from phase 2, where we're exploring the efficacy of our drug, into phase 3, where we're really on a path to registration, it's where we see consistently this very, very significant leap in value of biotech companies. And this is noteworthy because that's sort of where we are. We're kind of on the cusp of this transition over the course of calendar 2025. So it's a tough market. It remains really, really tough. But I think we're at the better end of it. Next slide, please. So now I want to shift gears and I want to talk a little bit about next month and about the data readout that we've got coming. And so if we just go on to the next slide, I want to preface this with a couple of reminders and a couple of health warnings. So just as an aid memoir for everybody, this is the structure of our phase 2b clinical trial. As you remember, we're looking at non-ambulant patients, that's to say the boys whose disease has progressed to the stage where they are now wheelchair bound. It is a randomized controlled trial. That is the gold standard of clinical evidence that regulators such as FDA look for. 1/3 of the patients go on placebo, 1/3 get each of 2 doses of the drug. And crucially, this is a double-blind study, which means nobody knows who's on what. Even the patients themselves, even their doctors, don't know who is in which group. And we do that to remove any possibility of bias or influence. Now, all the patients so far have had 6 months of treatment on placebo or on avocasen, as the case may be. And we're about to do a 6-month readout where we'll look at the data for those. And as Charmaine touched on earlier, that is only the first of several readouts we'll be seeing from the drug. We'll be seeing, of course, a 12-month readout in the middle of next year, then a final readout, which will wrap up in the latter part of 2025. So hopefully that's familiar to everybody, but I just wanted to refresh everybody's memories. Next slide, please. Now, just a couple of health warnings here. What we get in December will be what we call top-line data. That's almost invariably what companies initially announce in these situations. This will be initial safety endpoints. We'll have the efficacy endpoints. We'll have the baseline demographics of patients. We won't have all the things like the blood results and stuff like that. And we won't necessarily have all the many, many different statistical analyses that are applied to the efficacy data. So this will be our first glimpse of data, but the reality of a clinical trial is you continue to see new information as it progresses. So we'll share what we have as soon as we can in December, but there will be more to come, and we'll be sharing some of this in conferences, some of it through investor announcements, some of it in publications, and so on. I just want to stress that we have no visibility to this data whatsoever. This is a double-blinded study. We don't know what to expect in December. We have no premonitions, no advance read on this. We'll get the data right before you do. And because of that, we may not have an enormous amount of time to interpret it and study it and explain it. So what we'll do is, as soon as we have data, we'll be sharing it with you. But you may have to give us a little bit of time to sort of pick through all this and really understand in detail. Clinical trials are complex, and Duchenne is about as complex an illness as they come. So, we'll all be kind of working through this in real time when the data comes. So maybe if we move on to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that we will be looking out for. And I apologize, quite dense information here, but I just reiterate again, all of this is available via the company's website. One of the key things we're going to be looking for here is what's the difference between the drug and the placebo group. So if you look at the left-hand panel here on the slide, we'll see hopefully a line that reflects the treated patients, in fact, 2 lines, because we'll have 2 different doses, and a line that reflects the placebo patients. We want to see some distance between those. And obviously the question that's on everybody's minds is, well, what is the gap that we want to see here? What's the minimum? What are we expecting? And here's a couple of reference points. We'll see what we see, of course, in December, but In the phase 2A study that we reported a few years ago, the difference between the active treated group and, in that case, a historical control group was 2.9 points on this pool 2 score. Now, just to manage expectations, randomized controlled trials usually that comes down a little bit. I don't even know why, but it's usually the case in clinical development. So we may or may not hit that figure in this study. If we do, that is a shoot the lights out result. There's no question about it. That's a home run. But if we look at Capricor's drug, deramiocel, they've actually reported a number of different figures at 6 months, but the one that we think is most real, that we think is most relevant here, is a figure about 1.8 on this pool 2 score. So roughly a kind of like-for-like comparison. And then finally, as part of some of the clinician consultations we've been having over recent months, we actually asked the doctors, and we said to the clinicians in the US, what would you think would be a reasonable result here? What would be interesting? And the average figure we got back from that was 1.5. So those are a couple of benchmarks, a couple of relevant reference points. Again, we'll see what we see in December, but those are a couple of figures to put in people's minds. Now, on the right here, we touched on this concept of statistical significance. And this is one of the things that is, most labored in clinical trial results, and perhaps most misunderstood. Statistical significance describes the likelihood that an efficacious result is due to chance. And the usual threshold is 5%, or to put it in statistical terms, a p-value of less than 0.05. What that means is that when we report a result, there is a 5% or less chance that it's accidental. In other words, 95% chance that it reflects the true efficacy of the drug. Now, this study is powered to pick up a certain level of difference in the pool 2 score, but it is a relatively tight study. So if we're seeing relatively more modest levels of difference, we may or may not achieve statistical significance. There's a lot of things that go into that. This is technically an exploratory study, so it's not something that's necessarily an all or nothing result in that respect. Let's move on to the next slide. And on the left panel again here, I think one of the things that we're really interested to see is, regardless of the placebo group, and regardless of the difference between the treated group and the placebo group, what is the trajectory of the avocasen-treated patients? And there's broadly 3 ways that this might go. Now, look, if we do see any kind of evidence of improvement here, that's really interesting, because there is absolutely no drug that reverses the course of this illness. Now, to manage expectations, that is not our expectation for avocasen. In the phase 2A study, the pool 2 scores did go up a little bit, and that was a very, very exciting result to see. But we're very, very cautious about trying to hang our hat on that and suggest that this drug somehow reverses the course of the disease. What we're really hoping for here, what we think would be a great outcome, would be if we can make the case that avocasen is stabilizing the course of Duchenne, if it's just stopping these patients in their tracks, if it's stopping the deterioration of the illness. So we really want that line to be as flat as possible. We want the course of the disease for these avocasen-treated patients to be as stable as possible. If we can even slow the deterioration, that remains an extremely meaningful outcome. So if we can just change the trajectory, change the angle of this line, then that is also meaningful. But we'll be looking very closely at that, really trying to get a sense of how the avocasen-treated patients compare to our understanding of the natural history of Duchenne, which we touched on a little bit at the bottom. Briefly, just a few more points. So on the right here, we also actually want to look quite closely at the placebo group, because one of the really important questions is, how generalizable is our data? How much does it mirror the kind of data that other people are suggesting, and how much does it reflect the broader population of Duchenne? And the placebo group is a great way to measure that. It actually, if we get a result in the placebo group that looks very, very different to other clinical trials, or that looks very, very different to our understanding of the natural history of the disease, then it makes us ask the question, well, why is that? Why are our patients different? So we actually look very closely. Again, putting to one side the treatment effect, we look very closely at the behavior of the placebo group. So this is something we'll be studying as well. And if we can move on to the next slide here, and this is the final one here, just talking about clinical trial endpoints. But on the left-hand panel here, I just want to reflect the fact that Pool 2 is only one of the efficacy endpoints in this study. We do also have two other key measures, a myogrip and myopinch. As the name suggests, they measure grip strength and pinch strength in these kids. These are independent measures of the efficacy of a drug and something we'll be looking at really closely. And in fact, although we talk about the Pool 2 score in aggregate terms, it has components in it. It has a kind of a wrist and elbow and a shoulder notice. By the way, it's the shareholder's responsibility, not the company's. But and we have one shareholder that has filed such a notice in recent weeks. The company's register is available on request to shareholders. We'll happily share it. You know, it provides some useful information, but realistically, a lot of professional investors hold through nominee accounts, so it's a mixed blessing. Beyond that, I tend to take the view that our shareholders' investment in the company is a confidential matter for them. I don't really like to talk about any of our shareholders unless they talk about it, and so I think I'm going to plead the fifth here and respect the confidentiality of our shareholders. I will say that there were not just one or two institutional participants, there were more of the order of a dozen or so that came into the raise. And we know that at least one of those and probably others have since been buying stock on the market. All of them were scaled back in the raise, so they've continued, several of them have continued to buy. I think that's perhaps all I can comfortably say at the moment. Hopefully you can understand.
Question from Gennady. If we can pass Gennady the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, James. While we're on the capital raising, I've got a bit of a complex question to ask that covers a few topics, but in one. So this is more to do with the allocations during the capital raising. The constitution, current constitution, which was sort of proposed to be amended, but the current constitution as it is, and I guess tying into that, directors' duties to existing shareholders. So my question is, according to current constitution, section 3.4, which was proposed to be amended, one of the points says that when directors issue shares, they should be issued to members, whether in proportion to their existing shareholdings or otherwise, and to such other persons as directors may determine. So priority there and respect there should be to existing shareholders in allocations in accordance to the Constitution and directors' duties to act in the best interest of all stakeholders. I feel that in my personal case, where I was an existing shareholder, applied under the rules of the capital raising, under the account of the lead manager, and I was overlooked in favour of new investors who were not potentially shareholders in the company. You also had availability of the stock because you opened tranche 2, so there was no limit on the shares that you issued, but you've selected to prioritise some new holders, which I believe some of them are more like hedge funds that trade the stock, in favour of them rather than look at the existing shareholders. And looking at the top 20, reviewing the register, not many of the top 20 that were on the register at the date of the annual report participated in the raise.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll just say a couple of things there. So look, first of all, as I say, one of the strategic goals of this raise was to bring more institutional investors into the register. So obviously that is reflected in the composition of the register as it now stands. It's probably not the appropriate forum in an annual general meeting of all 3,600 of the company's members to address in detail your personal issue here. So I'm going to ask that maybe we kind of take that separately and we can kind of address that offline. And I think your question around the interpretation of the Constitution, I'm going to have to take on notice. Obviously, I don't have it in front of me. We have to study that. So maybe we can take that one on notice and discuss that separately. I'm not sure this is a forum in which we can do justice to it.
I'm just asking it, I guess, on behalf of other people who may be in a similar position, because I can only speak about myself and my own shareholding, but I understand that other shareholders may be in a similar position.
So if there are other shareholders that would like to ask that question, they are welcome to do so. Okay, thank you, Gennady. Want to comment? Yeah, okay. So Alexander, we just need you to take the microphone. So this is Alexander Brusano, who is from Minter Ellison.
Just to touch on that constitution point, Gennady, thank you. Briefly, just for everyone's benefit and knowledge that, thank you. Just for everyone's benefit and knowledge, that clause Gennady referred to is correct. It's clause 3.4, and the wording of the clause is the directors may issue to their members or to other parties. And the change which was proposed was just to change it or to an and, or the other and to an or, just out of good order. There was no other meaning behind that change. So just to give everyone benefit, that clause says the directors may issue.
Thank you, Alexander. I'm just going to see if we had any questions online that would be good to interpret.
We do have, and this one is to you, James. And again, it's around the capital raise. And I'll read it so that we get the total kind of thing. Okay. Initially, the requirement was for 8 million. This must have been discussed at board level to be enough for whatever your requirement was. Why did you then more or less double up on that figure, increasing dilution and putting our share price under undue pressure? For funds that obviously you could have moved towards without, did you actually give any consideration to shareholder dilution and consequence, that is pressure on our share price due to this decision?
Okay, there's a few parts to that question. let me try and take them in some sort of sequence. First thing to say is we've never said anything about looking to raise $8 million. I encourage everybody to look back over the company's ASX filings. We have not put a figure of $8 million into any of those. We had, as you'd imagine, some confidential discussions with a couple of investors in the run-up to this raise. Obviously, we talked to them a little bit about what they might invest, what the company might need. And in the context of those confidential discussions, various figures, various permutations of transactions were discussed. But we didn't say we were trying to raise $8 million. What we were trying to do, and what we said very clearly, was that we wanted to fund the company through to the completion of the phase 2B clinical trial. Now, as it happens, something like that kind of amount would probably just about get us there. But it wouldn't give us anything afterwards. So it would put us really a little bit in the position that we would have been in right now if we hadn't raised the money last month, which is that we would have imminent data readouts, we'd have some key milestones coming up, and we would have an overhang in the market and awareness that that the company would need to raise money. So I think the ability to finance ourselves as long as possible after this data readout really gives us as much clear air as possible. Certainly as we looked at the demand, as we looked at the kinds of caliber of investors that were expressing interest, we looked at the company's financing needs, the place where we landed at seemed to be the right place. And to be clear, we took a lot less than the demand was. This raise was significantly oversubscribed. We did dial it right back. Let's talk a little bit about dilution, because I think that was obviously a part of the question here. And I've spoken to probably 40 or 50 of our shareholders over recent weeks, and it's a topic that comes up often. And I completely understand where it comes from, but let's just start with the facts of the matter. This is a pre-revenue company. This company does not yet make income, let alone free cash flow. And until it does, it's going to need to find other ways to fund itself. And in general, that is through capital markets. Now, there are other places, grant funding, license deals and so on. But about 97, 98% of the time, the money in companies in our position comes through capital markets. So for anybody who invests in a company in our position, nothing to do with Percheron, this is a pre-revenue growth company, there is going to be some dilution. Now, that's not to say that we as a board should be blasé about this or we should be cavalier about it, but it's something that goes for territory in a company of this sort. Now, whether that's a concern for you as a shareholder, I think really should depend on what we do with the money. Now, if we went out and raised, in this case, the better part of $15 million, that's going to be the total gross proceeds of the transaction we're just completing. If we went and spent $5 million on a magnificent office Christmas party. Well, then, quite rightly, I would expect some shareholders to come to me and say, James, please don't do that again. That is not what we've invested the money for. And they would be correct in doing so. But that is not what we've spent it on. We can show over the last year that of the $11.6 million that we raised last year, we used that to advance the phase 2b clinical trial, to complete the toxicology study, and thereby to add $36 million of enterprise value to the business. We hope and we aim to do that and more in the year ahead. This money is earmarked to run clinical trials, to conduct FDA consultations, to manufacture product, to advance the value of our pipeline. That's what we use it for. And a couple of shareholders have said, well, what about salaries? And what about bonuses? And what about those things? We spend 15% of our cash in the last year on employee costs. And I'll tell you, it's some of the best money we've ever spent because we've got an excellent team on board. For comparison, in FY 2023, we spent about 19% of our cash on people costs. So as a proportion of our total spend, our people costs have come down this year. They are consistent with the most effective, the most lean businesses in our sector in Australia. And biotech companies don't run themselves. Clinical development is a field where nothing happens on autopilot. And without the very, very strong people that we built in this team, we would not be where we are today. So I'd put it to you that we're sensitive to dilution, of course. But if the money is being used to move the ball forward, that's what we're here for. That is the fundamental premise of a business like ours. And I think that's the question that shareholders should be asking us. What are you using the money for? What are the results that are visible? And I think the last year hopefully speaks to some of that.
Okay. Any other questions in the room?
Just one quick one. What's happening with Anthony's position?
Okay, the question is what is happening with Anthony's position moving forward? That's the last question I can take from the room because there's another one from online that's directed to me that I need to answer, and then we need to move on to the voting. So that's for James.
Sure. So the question again, for anybody who didn't hear online, was around one of the team, Anthony Philippus, our Chief Operating Officer, who's moving on to a new role next year. And look, ordinarily, I don't really like to talk about the individual employees of the company. I'm always respectful of people's privacy, but in this case, there's a certain amount of information in the public domain. First and most important thing is congratulations to Anthony. He's an extremely talented guy. He's taken a very big job, and they're very lucky to have him. And I think we all wish him every success in his new role. There's not many tougher jobs than being CEO of a public company, and I'm sure he's going to flourish in it. So we wish him well. And of course, we're all very sorry to see him go as a colleague. He's been a great member of the team. He does terrific work for us. In terms of what's been behind his decision, I'm sure he won't mind me saying that I think he's left the company with the greatest of reluctance, with a great deal of sorrow. We actually saw him off a couple of days ago, and I think it was very much a bittersweet moment for him. But of course, everybody has the right to pursue their career. As I noted, we have an exceptionally talented team, and I would go so far as to say any one of our employees could walk out of the company tomorrow and be re-employed by this time next week. And I think Anthony probably demonstrates the truth of that. In terms of what it means for us as a business, well, I think in some ways the timing is actually as good as it can be in these situations. Never great time to lose a terrific colleague. But we're at something of an inflection point in our partnering discussions. The last 12 months, we've had a lot of work building leads, building interest. Anthony has been right at the forefront of that and has done terrific work. I think with this data readout coming, we're now at a point where we're really trying to convert some of that interest. And I think that, as I say, creates a bit of a natural inflection point in the work, and I think makes it easy to transition on. We won't be replacing Anthony's role in the near term. We'll think about it perhaps in the medium term, but in the near term, I'll be doing double duty and be off to JP Morgan to talk to all these potential partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll just switch over. All right. So just finally, the online question to myself. It's a great question. What is the potential for going to the FDA for an accelerated approval, particularly if the 6-month data with the pool 2 shoots the lights out, to use one of James's terms, so shows a pool 2 a difference of 2.9 or greater. So thanks for that question. When we designed the study, that is something that we thought of. Would we be able to take data to the FDA with 6 months of data? The FDA usually wants longer than that. They'd like to see that, one, does your drug work in a disease like this? Does the impact that your drug has, is it sustained? And what happens if these patients don't get access to drug? And as you can see from the study design, that's what we designed. We have patients to demonstrate the initial safety and the effect. We then have a look at what sustained effect is. We have a look at what happens if you delay putting boys on treatment, those that were on placebo and have a delayed, turn them back. And then right at the end, boys come off treatment for 4 months. We see what happens. And then, of course, by opening up the compassionate use, we will have boys go back on treatment and then see what happens to them. So it's an incredibly rich data set. If a drug is able to demonstrate this really important difference in the patient's overall presentation, so not just the pool 2, but some of that other really rich data, then companies have gone to regulators, particularly in rare diseases, and particularly when there is a very strong patient advocacy. Companies have gone, and there is precedent, with data that has been, and I'm really speaking specific about FDA, but with data that has been generated outside of the United States, there is precedent where the FDA has granted that company what is known as an accelerated approval. In other words, the company is able to put the drug on market, but it comes with very specific post-approval commitments or requirements where the company has to follow through with additional data. That data, and it depends very much on the product, depends on the program and the patients. That data, the FDA either wants from a phase 3 study or they want from what's known as a registry study. And you don't know that until you get into negotiation with the FDA. Some of the precedent in this area was with the initial Sarepta approval, and NS Pharma actually also was able to get an initial approval with 6 months of data, with data from outside of the country. So when we package everything together and go and speak to FDA about potential development opportunities, this is something, of course, that we will raise with them. I can't put a measure of success on it. You really don't know until you're there and you're with them. And also, this is possible that one could take that same kind of data set and speak to the Europeans, particularly in this kind of disease where there's really nothing else for them that is demonstrating benefit. There was mention earlier that we had discussed with Europe previously and that was the fastest way to market. Actually, it was not the fastest way to market. When I came on board and had a look at that program, that was an exceptionally complicated study that I don't know how long that would have taken to recruit, but a long time, an incredibly expensive study. It was going to be a protracted way to market, and the Europeans, as you know, had requested a number of very challenging studies that had to happen afterwards. So, this is why we've shifted the focus to the US. If there is a phase 3 study required, of course, we would be talking to the Europeans and the US, and we would be looking at a global program to get both together. So that's that. I think, thank you for that question.